So welcome, Anka and Markku. I'm Jali. I work as a project coordinator here in HAMK Design Factory. Also, I do a lot of work related to visual design, graphic design, videographing and photographing, but also I'm part of a PDP course that we have in HAMK Design Factory. Could you, Markku, quickly also introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Jali. My name is Markku Mikkonen. I work here as our senior lecturer slash technical specialist here in HAMK Design Factory. I teach just like you in the PDP course, and also I teach in the DF workshops, different skill learning opportunities, and sometimes I do some research into skill learning and other topics.
Okay. Hi, my name is Anka, and I'm a marketing trainee here in the Design Factory. But I have been doing all kinds of things related to graphic design, helping out the staff members with different projects, and social media, for example.
Today is kind of one of our favorite topics. First, we're going to discuss about assumptions. I really want to quickly ask Markku, like, how would you, out of your head, try to define the assumptions?
Well, assumptions can be, in a very nutshell, be described as a method of making a decision or a basis that is not for certain based on facts. So it is based on what an individual already knows, but there is no proof to support that decision or decision making, for example. I think that would be the best way to very briefly describe what is assumptions, or what is it that when somebody assumes?
I feel like the most important part of that to understand is that there's no proof.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's something that leads to miscommunication many of the times.
Yes.
Most of the times.
So then, like, how do we try to, or how is like commonly then like done or happened in our scenarios, for example? Most of the time, I hear like people are saying like they're assuming something because they felt like it's pretty easier to assume than rather than check the facts.
Well, we use assumptions, I would say, almost on a daily basis. It is very dependent on the occasion. We might do assumptions on just normal life decisions, that what will I buy from the store because I assume that I have everything else in order, or when we're doing something work related, we might make decisions based on assumptions to move forward with our tasks. So, for example, if we're doing product development, so developing a solution for a certain user case group, we might make initial assumptions what our users are like or what type of needs our users would have, and then we would, based on that assumption, make a solution. But once again, if you're there, that if that is the final method before creating the final solution or final product, you're taking a big leap of faith that it will actually then work. You're assuming that it's a good idea.
Yeah, I think assumptions and assuming things is a really common thing people do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most of the people don't realize it. Probably no one realizes it when they assume something.
Mm-hmm.
It's I feel like if we start thinking about the things we have done in the past one day, in the past 1 hour, we are definitely going to find some things that we did because we had an assumption. And I think as long as someone is not consciously thinking about that, we don't realize those things.
Yeah.
So it's definitely important to understand what are assumptions.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, adding to that, it's like you could maybe follow up, like continuing, like, is assuming or making assumptions a bad thing? It's probably a bit of an ethical thing. So if you're making an assumption or a decision based on assumption, which will lead to an outcome that only affects you, I wouldn't say it's a bad thing, technically, if you are willing to learn from that experience. But then it becomes more risk effective if you make a decision based on assumption and it affects others, and you're not willing to take responsibility of that outcome afterwards. So it's a lot about thinking, how will you handle that outcome that comes with it? It's like, are you willing to take responsibility if your assumption wasn't based on facts, or if the result wasn't correct?
Yeah. So then, like, like many times it's like just like easy things like at home, for example, you just take somebody else's glass from the table because you assume that it's dirty or nobody doesn't need it anymore. But it's can be like really easily just tackled in a way that you just start asking the questions, or you start making sure that, hey, I got this mug, do you still need this anymore, or is there something else you want to do with it, or can I just put it to the dishwashing machine or something? And then you are already like solving the challenge that you didn't create any like grinding or bad things happening because you assumed to the fact, because you did the assumption based on, so the person was also affected by your assumption in that case.
Yeah, and another example for that could be also said if you're doing some type of skill learning. So let's say you're in an environment that allows you to learn, well, 3D printing, for example. It's very common in schools nowadays to get the opportunity to learn 3D printers. So if you as a student assume that you can just walk into the location where the 3D printers are located and just watch some videos and use them, and that's okay, there is a risk that you're skipping extra rules set by the university or the department or the organization who owns those printers. For example, the printers are only allowed to be used for educational purposes, or the printers are only allowed to be used within a certain time frame. So those then actually can lead to bigger risk outcomes if something goes wrong. So, for example, if you use them incorrectly, then it's not anymore like, for example, insurances that are willing to cover for you, and then you have to take the responsibility in this scenario. So, yes, if are making final decisions and not recognizing the potential risks that come with it, so you're assuming that it will all be okay, I can get away with this, then yes, that is wrong. So it is highly recommended that to get out of that type of behavior, you should always request for details and specifications. So we can make assumptions, but it is also our role to make sure those assumptions are facts. And the only way to do that is fact checking.
Yeah, and I think it's also pretty important to mention how important the choice of words we use are when it comes to assumptions, when it comes to having a conversation with someone, because I think most assumptions are being made when the communication is not clear.
Yeah.
So it's really important that when we are having a convo, we add as many details as we can. And it's probably impossible to give every single detail,
Yeah.
so that we answer every single possible question or assumption with that. But on the other hand, it's also important for the other person to ask
Yeah.
every question, because I feel like we are really used to not asking questions and just skipping them because it's more comfortable, or because we just think we know what the other person would think, so we assume what they would say or what they would answer. So I think it's important that we understand that asking all those questions are really important in order to get away from assumptions.
Yeah. And it's like when it comes to just the basics of things like how to do just communication with other people, like having, if you're on a date with somebody, or if you're hanging out with friends, or if you're speaking with a sponsor for an idea that you're developing. Everybody is coming from a different background, everybody has different understandings, everybody has different levels of vocabulary in their catalog, if you want to say. So it's during these scenarios, it's extremely important that if somebody says something and you maybe get triggered, or you get a misunderstanding, before you make a decision on how to continue with that conversation or that collaboration with the other person, you should first check what they actually meant. So if they said something, for example, that triggers you or got you mad, before getting mad, you should always check, like, did you actually mean this, or did you just happen to use maybe a set of words that I would assume means something negative? So to avoid future conflicts, it is extremely beneficial and important to maintain like fact checking during constructive communication, and not automatically assume what a certain person meant with what they said or presented even.
Yeah, and I think it's also something that we said a lot, that by assuming something, we basically have to automatically accept the consequences. So if the consequences are that we get hurt because we assume something, or that we get into an argument, or we get into a not so nice situation, we basically have to accept those and handle them the best way we can, because we got into those situations by assuming. So this comes with taking responsibility for assuming.
Yeah, exactly.
And accepting the consequences.
Like I'm always like wondering like from what level like we have been taught about like to start assuming. Maybe from like when we were kids, our parents were discussing about something or they were assuming, and then suddenly we start to also do it ourselves, or we just couldn't get that kind of type of a level of instructions, let's say, how to communicate, how to move on, how to like think about the consequences of assuming in the end. And because like many times people just do it because it's easier. You don't need to think about, you don't need to move, do a lot of brain work to do the thing. You could just assume and then you can continue.
Yeah.
Or then are they just super lucky in their lives in a way that they don't get like consequences out of it? Or why do they then continue the fact of how is like was led to the fact that they are just doing it all the time in the end?
I think the learning factor, like we're not, like when we're kids, we're not really being taught these type of communication factors, like assuming itself. So it's something we learn by watching our elders. We learn what we see and hear in society. And like you explained, it's like if we don't get caught in that scenario or in that outcome after assuming, then we move on. We don't really think about it that much. And usually when that happens, the assumption has been made for a topic that doesn't really have a big consequence to it if it's a big mistake. Or if there does happen something of a consequence level, but it only happens to us, well, we learn from it and we move on. But it becomes a whole different thing when there are other people or other parties affected with that outcome of the assumption. So, and usually we recognize those through communication conflict or debations, like how we understand certain topics or how was a task fulfilled through the misunderstanding. And this just boils down to the fact that we need to be more willing to recognize our decisions that we've made, and then if we recognize that they have been made based on no proof at all, so they are uncertain with their outcome, and if they might affect others around us, we should be always willing to check up, like, was the assumption fact? Or if it already has resulted into a conflict or an outcome or a negative experience, we should be willing to take that as a learning experience and recognize that the fault was actually in us. But once again, it's when it comes to communication, it's not only that we have to now on be able to learn good amount of words, so we're able to present everything very well, but we also have to be willing to listen. So it's not just about being able to talk constructively, but it's also about how you can listen and analyze the discussion. And then if something triggers you, you have to be willing to check, because if you're not gonna check, then the mistake might as well also be from your side also. So it's an equal effort.
Yeah, I think assuming probably comes from not feeling comfortable enough in every single situation to ask what's actually on your mind. And with time, because we got so used to it, and because, let's be honest, most of the assumptions we make don't have a serious consequence. So that's why we are not so conscious about them, because it happens, we learn from it, but it's not so significant that we would get stuck on it. So maybe that's why it's something that becomes so regular in our everyday life. For example, someone has a child, it's so important to provide a comfortable space for open communication from the time they're kids, from the time they learn how to speak, basically. Because with that comfortable environment for communication, they also provide them the options to ask all the questions they need. So they don't get so used to assuming. And obviously, there's probably no one in the world who doesn't assume.
Yeah, no.
Even
everybody
people
makes
who
them.
are super comfortable with these conversations and asking questions. But it's really important, in my opinion, to encourage people and to provide them this safe space, basically, for asking questions when you're having conversations. And it also includes, for example, if there are consequences, you're not going to crash out or you're not going to scream at the other person. And it requires this kind of mindset that I assume something, I accept the consequences.
Yeah. And I mean, in short, it's just, you could probably even say that people should be willing to accept that they can be wrong. And once again, there's nothing wrong with being wrong sometimes, if you want to say it so bluntly or plainly, but you have to be able to and capable to learning from it. So best ways to learn to live with making mistakes or how to build on your constructive communication skills is to study constructive communication, or then just do more collaboration with other people and discuss with them, understand them, build your recognizing, like, how do you yourself usually make assumptions and learn from those experiences.
Yeah, and like just like expose yourself to, like, I just want to now try to go in a level that I try to ask, either to confirm, I try to like go forward in a way that I try to communicate as much as possible to then don't have those assumptions in the later phases. And also it might boils down to the fact that for some people, or sometimes whenever you have done an assumption and you get consequences, but you don't even doesn't recognize that it was the fault of the assumption in the first phase. So you might not even like understand on that level that when it happens that it was the fault of the assumption, that you didn't just recognize that thing. But like, let's just boil to the fact that like we have been now discussing of like how the assumptions are affecting and how is going in the general way. Is there anything like from our side, in design factory side, how do we perceive assumptions? Like Markku, you quickly discussed that like 5 minutes ago. But then like, is there any other we want to like have an overview how it affects us, how it has been affecting how we do things, and then how do we in the later phases, how do we solve those challenges of teaching the students how to assume less and then move forward in the project itself?
Yeah, well, like you said, we here in Design Factory, we do experience assumptions in our learning experiences quite often. The most often location probably would be the product development project, because assumption making is a part of it. So when the students do get their initial challenges, they will have to make assumptions to begin the whole user research and product development journey. But it's only allowed at the start, when you're starting the project for the first time and you don't have any data about your users or your sponsor, or what type of technology could you use for the solution, or would it be even a technology based, or would it be a human behavioral based solution. So what happens then is, like, assumptions are only allowed when you want to do a kickstart, if you want to call it that, for a user research based journey of solution making. But then you have to immediately start fact checking again. So you want to switch those assumptions into facts. So if you have assumption, just like if you and me, or me and Anka, have a conversation and one of us said something that maybe have triggered somebody, we have to first, like, did you actually mean it in a negative way, or did that person mean it in another way? So when it comes to user research, if we have a assumption that our users are generally between the ages of 50 and 60, that's an assumption, so we have to fact check that. So you can then either do observations, you can do benchmarking, you can do interviews or surveys, any type of method that actually brings the facts, and then you can replace them, or replace the assumptions with those facts that you found.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth it to go an extra round or two to make sure that everything is clear, to ask those questions, other than, for example, in the product development project, then to proceed with an assumption, so that you have an assumption, and that's how you start the designing process.
Yeah.
Because then that could be a lot of wasted time and energy. for basically nothing.
Yeah, and
if the assumption is incorrect.
yeah, and especially what you said earlier about like from the personal aspect, it's like when you're creating a solution for a certain user group, you have to be willing to let go of your personal ideals because you're not creating a solution for you, you're making a solution for another group of members. So that means you have to, in a way, put yourself outside, even though if you fit into that user group, you have, because you're developing the solution, there's a higher risk that you get attached to your darlings or your ideated solutions. You have to put yourself out there and get other people who fit into that user group, their perspective, and based on that generalized outcome of data, build upon a solution that fits their needs. If you're building a solution for a majority, and this is the thing, it's like if you're building a solution for a majority, you have to listen for the majority's perspective.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, Marco, if you have any personal experiences between the walls of the design factory about assuming, and were there situations where maybe someone got out of these situations with a bad outcome, or when it was maybe a dangerous situation, or are there some experiences like this that you could share?
Well, I wouldn't say dangerous situations has ever happened, but like negative experiences to some degree happen almost a yearly basis. So this can be either in the PDP that we have or the product development course where students or other researchers have gotten attached their developed solution, or like we like to say, attached to their darlings, and they've just made a solution that fits their needs, and they've assumed that the end users or the customers would also like it. That's the most common one. It happens every year. But if I would have to say something more drastic, is probably then with our machines that we allow. So we have a lot of learning opportunities for skill development. And when it comes to different type of machines like 3D printers, laser printers, large scale printers, vinyl printers, woodworking and metalworking, we've had occasions, and we will probably always will have, where people make assumptions on how they can access these machines. And in the past, we've had occasions where people have made a decision like how they can access them. They've gone and worked with them, and then if they've made, or when they've made a mistake, they've had to pay for the consequences that come with it. So it's been a mostly a negative like experience for that user because they assume that they can just go use them without any consequence or without extra training that is required, and then they were surprised that they have to pay for potential mistakes if the machine breaks, or if they hurt themselves, or if they don't have the rights to even work with that machine. For example, we don't have rights to all of the things we have in our building or in this campus.
Just like going back to like when we were discussing about the product development course and or how the students take their first assumptions to get the kind of the whole thing going, but also it boils to the fact that whenever the students are then in their own team, they can easily start to have occasions where they start assuming like, oh, I haven't seen this person in 2 weeks, he's not doing anything, or the and also it can happen the other way around, that the person who has been missing for 2 weeks have been assuming that there isn't any work for him, and then it's all about both the fact that there wasn't enough communication in the team.
Yeah.
And then they're surprised that the fact that whenever we conform them and be like, hey, have you been discussing? I'm like, no, we assumed, like,
Yeah.
of course, yes. So it happens not only like in the product development level and when they're doing like the first initial assumption, but also it happens in the team level when they're
Yeah.
doing the discussions and communication and working just together.
Yeah.
So it might happen in that level too.
Yeah, well, like Jali explained, it's like the most common mistake that student teams do when they're collaborating as a team or co-creating as a team is they assume that everybody within their team is on the equal understanding on how the project will progress, or what steps will everybody take, or what is everybody's role in the group. So lack of communication is a big affecting factor or downhill for a team if they don't tackle it as soon as possible.
Yeah, as a student perspective, because I'm also a student, I think it it also adds to this whole thing that when you are working with strangers, basically, obviously you know each other for months or maybe even years. When you work with strangers, you maybe don't have that level of connection with them that you can have those conversations that you should be having. And it's not like you can't have those, but maybe you would rather not have them. So obviously, assuming is easier to get away from when you're talking with someone who's close to you, or when you're in like in your family,
Yeah.
or something like that. But when it's actually about communication with a group of strangers, it's definitely harder.
Yeah, and that's like a very good example. It's like with our family and close friends, we get away with assumptions much more often because we're more forgiving, and then we're not recognizing the potential outcomes or the negative experiences if they produce any. But when it comes to like building or communicating with strangers for the first time, or when you meet your new team for the first time, you might not be as comfortable to be open with them or be very relaxed or be ready for a confrontation, if that's what you want to call it. But that's also important that the other team members are willing to go out their way to like start the conversation. So like I said earlier, to build upon constructive communication, it's not just about talking. You have to also be willing to listen and analyze the situation within the team. So if you are personally comfortable being an extrovert, for example, and you recognize that not all your team members are yet as comfortable to open up, maybe you can start the communication and then just listen and analyze that situation. And then if you notice some weird behaviors going on, then you should always double check on what did each member mean. But it's a equal battle, you could say. It's not just about everybody needs to be an extrovert, but it's more about being willing to recognize others and then acting upon it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's why it's nice to work in groups, actually, because everyone is so different. We all have a really different background of how we grew up, what kind of relationship we have with communication itself. So that's why it's important that we actually listen to all of our team members and that we take their advice and that we hear them, I would say. And also something I wanted to mention earlier is that some assumption as a phrase is really, really commonly used in the design factory. And I have not been to a place before where people would be so conscious about assumptions and assuming. And at first, I didn't quite get it because I didn't think much of it. But as I was getting more into working here and getting used to the environment and actually facing assumptions and maybe reality checks about my own assumptions, I became way more conscious about it. And once a person becomes conscious about their own assumptions, it's really everywhere and it's really happening all the time. And I feel like it's a really good way to get better at communication if you recognize that you're assuming things and if you learn from them. So if you're open for those questions and you're open for those possible confrontations that come from assuming, it's definitely a really, really good way to learn from it.
Yeah.
And like in here, like you, for example, for me, like I always like go into the like brain of mine and be like, am I now assuming? And if I am, I need to somehow make it so I will fact check it or something. Or I will always make sure that there wouldn't be a scenario where there would be assumptions. But it's like it still might happen, but it's like it's good that you are aware of the fact that you might be assuming, and then you would need to somehow make it so that you check it out why it's happening or how you would confirm your kind of assumption in that scenario.
Of course, there is like situation where you can't always check facts. It's like if you're restricted to information, or the people you're trying who know the answer can't be reached. But then the other decision that if you move forward, you just have to be willing to then take the responsibility. It's like that's like you shouldn't be then afterwards surprised if the outcome didn't happen to work out like as planned. So that's like probably the most important part about assumption making is like if you do assumptions or if you make assumptions, you have to be willing to take the responsibility. That's the bigger take of it, I would say. And then also everybody should be willing to also recognize that as a learning experience, but also about being willing to take responsibility.
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe to end this podcast episode, we can ask our listeners and viewers to think about when was the last time they assumed something, to think about some events in their life which were maybe a bit more significant, and look at it from the perspective, were there any assumptions behind that, or to think about some arguments.
Yeah.
Did any of the arguments happen recently in their lives because of assumptions? And also not just about how they felt and what they assumed, but also to consider the other individuals who were involved in their assumption.
And also like to start to actively just to listen to the fact that whenever people are assuming, just to like recognize the moment when somebody assuming and then try to think about it, like how does it affect then from the perspective of the others.
Yeah. And my final take would be just to like maintain a constructive environment with others.
Yeah.
Like being willing to constructively talk, but also constructively listen to what you've analyzed from others or from the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this was the Home Design Factory's podcast discussion about assumptions and assuming. And hopefully we will be back with another interesting episode and another interesting topic in the future.